Hey there, Kendall County. This is John Tipton and Robert Sines with the Texas Examiner. Today, we are experiencing some unusually warm weather in almost spring in the Texas Hill Country. And with that, we are going to be discussing a topic that has become or should be at the forefront of your minds, and that is human trafficking. And today we have with us two guests that are very embroiled into the topic of human trafficking, on how to combat it, how to identify it, and ways to make sure that we as a society are doing everything that we can to prevent this human trafficking. So today is going to be a very interesting topic, one I think that some of our listeners and viewers may try to put blinders on because they don't want to admit that it is here.
Yes. It's happening. It's happening not just globally, John. It's happening in the United States. The United States is actually the #1 destination now for sex trafficking, right, and human trafficking. And then, of course, it's happening in Texas, in small towns, big towns. And so we're very fortunate today to have our special guest, Annie Sovcik, with Truckers Against Trafficking, national organization. You'll learn a little bit more about them. And then we also have a person who's been a victim of trafficking, Kelly Alsobrook. And we're very, very honored to have both of you. So welcome, Kelly. Welcome, Annie, to the show.
Welcome, guys. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Why don't we start with you, Annie? Tell us a little bit about TAT and of course, yourself, how you ended up working for this organization.
Great. Thanks. Yeah. So TAT is a nonprofit organization that exists to educate, equip, empower, and mobilize members of key industries and agencies to combat human trafficking as part of their everyday jobs. So, you know, our theory of change really is rooted in the belief that by engaging with the trucking industry, the truck stop industry, the energy industry, the bus, school transportation, public transit industries, with law enforcement, government agencies, and a variety of others, that we can effectively mobilize millions of people to move from passive bystanders to active disruptors of this crime. So I came to TAT just about 6 years ago, in early 2018. My background is in law. Prior to working with TAT, I spent about 12 years working in Washington, D.C. on policy issues and at a national and international level that related to a variety of human rights abuses and protection of vulnerable people. So anti-trafficking policies, but also anti-torture, as well as policies to protect people who are fleeing their homes because of war, oppression, or other types of violence.
It's wonderful. It seems like this is a passion of yours, and it's a tough topic. But what drives you? Why this field?
You know, it's hard to tell. You know, when I was in law school, I was a kind of typical law student who started because it seemed like a good career path, but didn't necessarily know exactly what I was going to do kind of with that education or with that degree. But during the summer between my first and second year of law school, I ended up kind of almost spontaneously joining a group of other students along with a professor of mine down in the Harlingen-Brownsville area of Texas, working with people who are facing deportation, but also people who are being held in immigration detention, who were fleeing political oppression in their home countries, and started to work with them on their legal cases, but got very, very interested in many more of the kind of broader kind of systemic issues that contributed to vulnerabilities, but also kind of impacted people's pathways to freedom and to creating kind of the lives that they had dreamed for and hoped for. And it was through that work that I ended up spending a few years working on cases connected to child victims of human trafficking, and then just a whole variety of other stuff. And It's hard to say what it is that drove it, but I do know that once I started to become exposed to this work, there was really no turning back.
Of course. And John, we're going to talk a little bit more as the show goes. We're going to come back to Kelly a little bit, and Annie, of course, to talk about what human trafficking really is. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there, a lot of fear,
right?
And we're going to cover that today. But before we get back to that, let's talk to Kelly Alsobrook. Kelly, you're in, did you say Memphis today?
Yes, I am in Memphis.
Okay. Kelly, tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience with TAT.
I am a training specialist / survivor leader with TAT. I train law enforcement. I speak at our coalition build, and I just bring that awareness from my own personal experience, because I think if people could understand the other side of it, the backstory of how someone gets involved and what is actually happening with these victims, then it opens their eyes to a whole new thing, and it takes away that perception of that white van or the paper towel on the car doors or things like that, or what even movies represent, And so for me, I feel it's very important to share my story, because how can someone get an understanding if they don't hear it from someone who's walked in those shoes?
Completely agree. Completely agree. So I know that we've got a whole set of questions, but I got to tell you, the first thing that comes to mind, and both of y'all kind of touched on this in a different manner. I think that right now, in addition to, the human sex trafficking, it's closely related and tied to what's going on down at the border.
Sure.
I have heard, and I have not independently verified, that there are folks that believe that the U.S. government or the taxpayer is in a way, not necessarily intentionally, but facilitating sex trafficking today, in that these young women, these young men are coming to the border as refugees. They've got addresses either written or tattooed on their arm. And because of the current policies that we have in place, as I understand it, we're doing our job. The Border Patrol is doing their job. They're doing their best to get those children to the address that is listed on their arm to make sure that they're getting connected and they're sponsored in the country. But it turns out some of those addresses and some of those folks are actually involved in sex trafficking. Have you heard anything along those lines? Can you corroborate any of that? Do you have any insight?
Well, I don't think there's any evidence that there's any kind of vast conspiracy on the part of the U.S. government to be trafficking children. But we'll note that people who are leaving their home countries, whether it is because of war or extreme violence or oppression, or living under dictatorships or starvation or other reasons that are prompting people to risk their lives to travel to the United States, they're extremely vulnerable. And we can talk a little bit more about the various kind of vulnerability factors that traffickers prey upon. Sure. Because criminals know that people who are in desperate circumstances, people who have ideas about what the American dream is, or people who have ideas or hopes or ambitions for their future or for the safety of themselves or for their family, that they are highly susceptible to manipulation, to promises of opportunities, and they use that. And they use their hopes, dreams as weapons, really, to victimize people and to use them and exploit them. And so certainly I think what we're seeing connected to the migrant crisis is a lot more desperate people, a lot more vulnerable people who then the criminals, the traffickers are preying on. But, as we will talk a lot more about, the overwhelming number of victims of human trafficking in the United States are U.S. citizens being perpetrated by U.S. citizens. And so there are overlaps with immigration, but it is certainly not specifically an immigration issue.
Thank you for that, Annie. And that's a good segue back to Kelly. Kelly, you're obviously a U.S. citizen or here from the States, and tell us about your story, how you became a victim of trafficking.
Well, it started with the way I grew up. I grew up in a very abusive household with a father who he was mentally abusive, physically abusive, mentally abusive. And one of the things that always stands out to me is that he would always tell me every single day that I was nothing, that I would never be anything, and I would never amount to anything. And so from the age of 12 to 15 is when the sexual abuse started. So in saying that, I had several vulnerabilities. I didn't have the love from my family that I needed, especially from my dad. I had already experienced trauma in my childhood. And so that in itself creates vulnerabilities. So how many young ladies or young men do you see that have low self-esteem or no self-esteem, and all they want is somebody to love and care for them? And I was also a single mother at 18, and even having a good job, I got into a situation where I was hit by a car. I couldn't work. So I lost my apartment and we were living in my car. And so I was in dire need. And the one thing that I wanted more than anything was to be able to take care of my daughter. And so when I had gone to South Beach, I'm originally from Miami. And so I moved to South Beach thinking, okay, I can get a job at a restaurant or hostessing or whatever. And I was staying in a hotel. And so my first trafficker, he walked by and saw me sitting there and he said, "Hey, beautiful." Whoa, somebody just called me beautiful. I was not accustomed to that. And so then that's when the grooming process starts. They get to know you. So there were lots of questions asked, and I took it as, wow, he's really interested in me. And, he was paying for our hotel room. He was paying for our food. He was paying for everything for my daughter. And after a couple of months of this, that's when the switch happened. And he said, "Hey, I need you to start making some money." And when he told me that he was a pimp and he told me what he expected me to do, he used my child against me. What he said was, "What kind of mother would you be if you can't even take care of your basic needs for your daughter?" And think about it. I didn't have any familial support. I didn't have any friends that I could go to. I felt like I owed him at this point because he had done so much for me. And how was I going to take care of my daughter?
And you're 19 at this time or so?
18.
18.
Wow.
Okay.
And that's how it started.
And it's you mentioned the word grooming, and that's something that I've given some talks on human trafficking, and I caution parents about that it's a slippery slope. it's important to show our children love and support, and also identify these other people that are trying to groom our children. Right. You know, and grooming is giving them compliments or a false sense of security, or a false sense of friendship, and it's a slippery slope. Before you know it, they start trusting these people more.
Right.
Kelly, is it safe to say that when you started working for this man, you felt like you couldn't go to the authorities because you were doing something illegal or wrong?
One of the things that traffickers do is they put the fear of God in us about law enforcement. If we talk to law enforcement, we get a beating. If we go to jail, we get a beating, because we're losing money when we go to jail. Law enforcement, and see, it's so intricate, and he had my daughter somewhere else. So how was I going to go to law enforcement when I didn't even know where my daughter was?
Oh.
And that's one of the things that people need to understand. There is that control and that fear. And then you start to believe that's who you are. That's who you were made to be. And so what law enforcement encounters is the trauma, not the person inside, but the actual trauma. So that's why when law enforcement sees someone who is being prostituted, they will get that ugly side of them. Oh, get out of my face. You know, oh, he's just my boyfriend. I don't need your help. Why are you messing with me? And that's what you're going to find. That is what you're going to see. You are going to see the trauma before you see the person.
And what do you tell law enforcement officers when they run into this? And what kind of advice do you give them?
It's just about that victim-centered approach. And what I mean by that is I talk to law enforcement about building a rapport with them, making sure that they're not just attacking them. Also, there are plenty of victims that have had run-ins with law enforcement that weren't very good, that were treated like dirt, were asked for sexual favors in exchange for not going to jail. And if law enforcement would just actually acknowledge, hey, I know that, you know, you may have been hurt by law enforcement. I am so sorry for that. We are not all that way. I truly want to help you. And if law enforcement, hey, do you need some water? Are you hungry? Because a lot of times we are deprived of food, of sleep, our basic needs, because if we don't make quota, that is part of the punishment.
It's interesting, John, because, you know, in law enforcement, there's this stigma. You see a young lady on the streets, or, you know, they don't consider her a young lady. They consider her a prostitute, right. And they don't always look at her as a victim. And there's that barrier of entry or communication. And I was speaking with Annie Sovcik in Midland, Texas, to hundreds of truck drivers and people in the oil industry. And many of them came up to us after the presentation and said, wow, there's these man camps out here, and these men that are out here alone, and these young ladies come in and they drop them off. And the guys said, well, we didn't think there's anything wrong with it. We just thought they were hookers, and they're out here with the guy. So they didn't feel like reporting any of it. And one of the things that was said to them by somebody was, look, you don't have to call the authorities. Sometimes just tell your buddy, hey, do you realize that this could be a victim of sex trafficking? And maybe this person isn't willingly doing this. Maybe they have to do this. And it just changed the whole mindset of these men. They were thinking like, wow, this has been happening under my nose and I haven't done anything about it. I've considered a victimless crime. And so is that fair, Annie, to say that maybe society needs to rethink that and look at these young ladies, even young men, as maybe, potential victims? And how do you approach them? And outside of what Kelly mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, one of the kind of goals of TAT is to change perceptions about prostituted people and to increase empathy that not just law enforcement, but kind of the general public and the industries that we work with have for people who may be in kind of desperate situations or situations where they are being compelled to do things via force, fraud, or coercion, and either not have options or not feel like they have options, and to not be part of perpetuating the crime, to not be part of fueling the demand for the crime. It is our deep, deep belief that if there was no buyer, there would be no victim, and therefore there would be no sex trafficking. And so by empowering men who are interested in this, who care, to actually have those conversations with other men, that we can make significant inroads. And so we do have work that we've been doing on addressing demand. We've got a short video that that people can watch that kind of looks at various types of sexual violence and sexual exploitation, and kind of where does kind of prostitution and the commercial sex industry kind of fit into that, but also that empowers them with some tips and some questions to ask or ways to kind of challenge their friends to be able to talk about this more openly. Because a couple of things that we know is that, it's a minority of men who do purchase sex, but the ones who are purchasing a lot. And so how do we raise up more of the majority voice to make their decisions and acts not be normalized, but also to make sure that there's an increased understanding that most prostituted people at some point in their lives have met the definition of sex trafficking victim, even if it's not in that moment, because any minor who's involved in commercial sex is a victim of trafficking automatically. And so if the average age of becoming prostituted is 16 or 17 years old, then that means that they were a victim at the time that the exploitation began, and that turning 18 doesn't suddenly change someone's reality, even if the law is perceiving them as different. And so I think those are just a few important things that people understand about this crime. It is not a victimless crime.
I'm curious, Robert, do you think that there's a stigma applied to the current laws on the books with regards to prostitution? Ladies, how do you view the current laws that we have in place? I understand it. You have laws for soliciting prostitution, and then you have laws that are geared towards
arresting the
actual
person committing the act.
Right.
I certainly think prioritization needs to be going after pimps and traffickers or any of those kind of middleman managers that are profiting off of this exploitation, and to go after buyers.
And go ahead, Annie, I'm sorry.
Oh, and I was just going to say that then viewing the kind of the individual, the prostituted person, the person who is selling the sex, as someone who may not be there voluntarily, who most likely wants to be doing something else, and providing them with an avenue for resources, for support, for pursuing something different, or for kind of being free of that, but allocate the resources to prosecuting and punishing to the real criminals in this situation, which are the traffickers, the pimps, and the buyers, not the victims.
Kelly, I was going to ask you a question. You were 18 at the time when it started for you. How old was the man that approached you and led you into this path?
He was about 30. 31.
Okay. Okay. So the reason I asked you that is because remember, I think Annie mentioned that one of the dangers is also is not always some 30, 40-year-old man. Sometimes it's peers, right? You have a 16-year-old girl and she has a 16, 17-year-old friend that takes her to a party, and that's where the slippery slope starts. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Kelly or Annie?
Well, here's the thing. Traffickers can be anybody. It can be male, female, older, younger, anyone who can have influence over someone else. And it could be a best friend. It could be a family member. That is really huge right now, is familial trafficking, where parents, grandparents, uncles are selling their own family members. And so that is also one thing that people need to realize, is that a trafficker can be anybody. It's a greed operation. And, I do want to circle back to the laws. And there are a lot of states that are making the first time offense of purchasing sex a felony. And I think every state needs to adopt that, because if there was no buyer, then there would be no demand, and that would mean no trafficking. Because here's the thing. There is not one person that wakes up and says, it is my life's dream to sell my body. Nobody says that. So, sorry, I get a little passionate.
That's so true.
Understandable.
And
something we need to think about.
Right. And so addressing the demand aspect is something that we really need to look at even more. And, because I will tell you that the buyers can be just as brutal, if not even more brutal, than traffickers. They feel like, oh, I've given her my money. There's nothing I can't do to her.
I own you now.
Exactly. And so people need to keep that in mind. And the porn industry plays a really big part in what some of the buyers are seeing. And they're not going to do that with their wives or their girlfriends. They feel like they can go and purchase someone and do those acts with them. And so there's just so much to this, so much.
And Kelly, how long did you suffer through this or stay in this industry before you finally got out?
5.5 to 6 years.
It's a long time. And so when did you make that exit or escape, and what prompted you to say, enough, I'm out of here?
My very last trafficker, he actually did kidnap me because I was hanging out with a girl who was actually running from her pimp. And so when we got to California, well, first of all, he had one of his friends grab my daughter, and when I ran out, he had a gun to my head. And so we went to California, and that very last night that I was with him, he had beaten me so badly that I was unrecognizable. He tried to drown me in a bathtub. He poured alcohol on me because he was going to set me on fire. And when he got tired of beating on me, he choked me to the point where I had passed out. And there was not a place on my body that was not bruised. That's how bad the beating was. And it was for hours. And then he wanted me to go out on the track. And it was 2 law enforcement officers who they did so much right. They knew that my daughter was the most important thing to me. They knew he needed to go to jail. They put us in protective custody, and they took care of all of our basic needs. And so when we went to court, or we didn't even get a chance to go to court because he plea bargained. And once I was finally free, that's when my life started turning around. I mean, you know, it is a long journey in healing. So unfortunately, I got into domestic violence situation after domestic violence situation because, see, there's got to be healing.
Yes.
And I hadn't healed from the trauma of my dad. I hadn't healed from my trafficking experience. And then I get in these domestic violence situations because that's what I think I'm worth. So, but during my I've been on a healing journey for the last 16, 17 years, and my life is totally different now. And so, you know, I tell people all the time, those that look like they're helpless, hopeless, and they'll never get out of their situations, they can, but it depends on us as a society being able to be those change makers and think about what that person that you have given up on, think about what their life could be. I mean, I was in corporate America for almost 20 years. I owned my own nail salon. Now I have my dream job with Tat. And that's why I share my story.
And thank you for that, Kelly. I know this is a tough thing to discuss, to go through that difficult journey and challenging journey in your life. If I may ask you, though, you mentioned your daughter went through this with you as well. How did she fare, or how is she doing?
I could have been a better mom, is what I can say. And, you know, she went through a lot with me, especially going through the healing process, but she's a strong young lady.
Wonderful. And Annie, can you tell us more cases that TAT has been involved in, similar to Kelly's, where you guys have helped other victims as well?
Sure. So, you know, our, you know, one of the taglines that you'll see on most of our materials is, you know, make the call, save lives, you know, everyday heroes needed. And, you know, in the work that we do with our kind of industry partners, you know, which is, you know, concerned citizens, you know, which is a little bit different than law enforcement. You know, what we're doing is giving people kind of insights, giving them some basic education about the realities of the crime, but then encouraging them to contact authorities, to call law enforcement, to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline for victim services, and depending on what they're seeing, what their interactions are, taking steps to get either law enforcement or victim services involved. So we're not asking people at all to try to intervene physically. We are not asking people to try to rescue victims. That is not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is for people to report what they're seeing, or if they're having an interaction with a potential victim, to ask them some additional questions, basic things like, are you okay? Do you need help? What's going on? Are you interested in receiving services? Are you interested in getting help, getting to somewhere else today? Really simple stuff. Mm-hmm. And then seeing what they want from there. So a couple of examples of that, just in the state of Texas. So, one of the truck stop partners that we work with, who has trained their employees, they've put up posters and other kind of victim or survivor or facing information about human trafficking. They had a young woman who was at the truck stop, had approached one of the employees at the truck stop and told them that she was under the control of a man who was on the premises, and that she wanted help. And the cashier, who had a relationship with, or let the manager know, the manager who had a relationship with the local sheriff's office, contacted the sheriff, who came out. They engaged with the young woman, asked her some questions, and then ran her information through kind of a missing persons report, found out that there had already been a missing persons claim filed against her, and then ended up taking steps to get her connected back to her family where she wanted to return to. So that's one example. In another situation, this actually was out of El Paso, and did involve an immigrant victim of labor trafficking. So he had come to the United States thinking that he was on a valid work visa to work for a construction company. That construction company had like a traveling construction crew. And when they were relocating from one location to another, the leader of the crew had taken all of their identification documents, wasn't paying them, was controlling their communication. And then they were near El Paso when the young man confronted the leader of this crew about not paying them, and about some medical issues that he had, that he needed some treatment for because of injuries he had suffered on the job. And the leader of the crew refused to pay them. And then in the middle of the night, they just abandoned him. The belief of this young man was that he was trying to make an example of him and send a message to the rest of the crew that you don't question me. But also that he just didn't want to deal with him anymore. And the young man had just started walking. He didn't have a phone, he didn't have ID, he didn't have any money, just started walking and found himself at a bus station. He had approached the employees at the bus station, let them know what had happened. They were able to connect the dots to say, this actually sounds like a labor trafficking situation. They gave him some food, some potato chips from their lunch. He clearly hadn't eaten for a while, was severely dehydrated. And together they contacted the National Human Trafficking Hotline, who was able to arrange for shelter, for services, got him connected to law enforcement so he could pursue a case against the trafficker. So those are just a couple of examples of the kinds of things we celebrate, are the simple acts of asking some additional questions, and then calling authorities and getting people involved who can then take it from there and actually then help assist survivors or pursue prosecution against traffickers.
And it's great what TAT's doing, John. And as you know, I'm a retired Border Patrol agent. And back in the 90s, I was a supervisory special agent in El Paso, leading a team of investigators, kind of like what they call ICE today. And you've probably run into it. Many of our viewers have probably run into it, where you're sitting at a restaurant and these kids that are deaf mute come up and they leave you a little keychain with a note that says, "I'm deaf mute. We made these keys. Can you give us a donation?" Right. Well, in that, unbeknownst to me at the time, that was an organized criminal group that was, they were also deaf mutes, but they were controlling the families. And they brought them into the U.S. under the pretext that they were going to be gainfully employed, but they would keep the family members hostage, and then they would send these kids out there to sell these little trinkets and collect money. Right. And it was basically panhandling, but all that money was going back to the traffickers. I had to get one of our agents trained in sign language to infiltrate this group. not only English sign language, but Spanish sign language. And we were able to dismantle this organization, but it was huge. And that's another example of where the victims are beholden to their handlers.
Right.
In this case, the communication barrier was keeping us from helping them. But there are stories after stories. And having worked in the Border Patrol, I saw a lot of these forced labor cases.
Right.
And it's not just immigrants. It's also, like kids, citizens,
well, it's just
strays.
Like Texas Ranger Kevin Wright told us in one of our last episodes, where he had a case of a young man and a young woman both, but they were kidnapped here in the States and they were being taken the other direction, south of the border. And it was suspected that it was for sex trafficking. I also, as a private investigator, I have had multiple, more than I care to talk about, more than I care to count, domestic cases where the case has led to one of the members of the marriage going to a hotel room, and I'm taking surveillance photos and pictures, and you get used to that enough, you start being able to pick out who the handlers are.
Sure.
Because they are always right there.
Right.
And of course, my first reaction at that time is I need to call the cops and let them know I'm there. And fortunately, 9 times out of 10, they'd say, yeah, we already know. We're already on it. Right. And that didn't really make me feel a whole lot better, because I didn't see them crash the door and go in and make the rescue right then. And it sounds to me like it's a really involved process in order to successfully bring somebody back into the fold, a victim back into the fold,
sure,
and reintegrate them into society. And that, to me, speaks largely to there's a huge corporate responsibility. You were mentioning the man camps. Well, as a private security company owner, we were asked to provide bids for providing gate guard security for all the oil fields out in West Texas, and even some down here south of us. And I found out that we lost a bid for one of the contracts because our competitor would actually bus in prostitutes for these man camps.
That's it. In their eyes, they're justifying it as
a
service.
It's a service, and all of these young ladies are willing participants.
And that's where I think a lot of us and what these ladies are doing is educating us that most of these are not willing participants.
Right.
They feel like they don't have a choice, or they're being trafficked.
Right. And that's what I meant by corporate responsibility. And I've been following TAT for quite a while because of my involvement in private investigations and desire to see an end to this. And again, I just think there's a huge corporate responsibility with your oil companies. All these folks need to be training their own people, bringing in these
and I
folks.
And that's what Annie was doing when I met you for the first time, Annie. You were talking to all these corporate executives in the oil industry and encouraging them to have a reporting mechanism, a policy in place. And you should have seen the faces. I think a lot of these people were surprised or unaware that this was really a problem. And so I thank you, Andy, for what you're doing. Kelly, obviously, your courage is immeasurable, and I appreciate you having the courage to come out here and talk about your situation. But before we close, I want to ask Andy to dispel, and I think we have so far, but dispel the perception that maybe mainstream society or the media has about when we talk about sex trafficking and human trafficking. Could you talk a little bit about that, about the misunderstandings?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple major myths. One is this idea that human trafficking doesn't happen here. I think we have established very clearly, that human trafficking is happening in the United States. It's happening in urban, suburban, and rural areas. It is a crime that is driven by greed and is fueled by demand for commercial sex and cheap labor. And, we need to kind of address it kind of from all sides in order to both prevent it and then to effectively intervene in it and to ensure that survivors have access to resources. I think the other thing is that trafficking is often conflated with kidnapping. And while sure, it's possible that there are some cases that do involve kidnapping and trafficking, in the overwhelming majority of cases, victims or survivors had a relationship with their trafficker, some type of relationship, whether it was an employment relationship, a romantic relationship, a friendship, a familial relationship, that they had some type of relationship with their trafficker prior to their exploitation. And that one of the reasons for this is that traffickers use tactics of grooming, of relationship cultivation, of getting to know their victims, getting to know their sensitivities, getting to know their levers, where they can control them, and that whole psychological control becomes a critical piece of how traffickers operate and how they control their victims. And one of the reasons why this crime can stay kind of hidden in plain sight, and why members of the public may actually have the potential of coming into contact with victims, because they're not being hidden behind locked doors or in basements or anything like that. They are out in the community, but they are under the control of someone else. And I think the final piece is just that trafficking and smuggling are different crimes. You know, trafficking is the exploitation of someone for sex or for labor, where someone else is making a profit. You know, smuggling is crossing an international border, usually for a fee, usually in a consensual type arrangement. But that's not to say that smuggling can't turn into trafficking. Sure. Or that immigrants are not extremely vulnerable to traffickers, but they are distinctly different crimes. And it's really important to think about the approach as distinctly different. And just that, you know, the overwhelming majority of victims never cross an international border, and there's no requirement for crossing an international border in order for the crime to constitute.
And how do our viewers get a hold of you, ladies, or your organization if they have a suspicion of a neighbor, a friend, or they see something? How do they get a hold of you to report this?
Well, to report suspicions of human trafficking, either call 911 if you're seeing a crime in progress, or you have concerns about a child. Call law enforcement. Mm-hmm. If you're interacting with an adult victim who wants services, you can call 3737888 and help that individual access resources. If you're interested in just learning more, in looking at one of Tat's training videos and finding out more about us as an organization, you can visit truckersagainsttrafficking.org, or send an email to info@truckersagainsttrafficking.org. But we are not a report receiving organization. All we'll tell you is to call law enforcement if you reach out to us.
But you can, yeah. But if I have, I'm not sure I want to call law enforcement, but I see some things that raise my suspicions. Is it okay to call you so you can kind of guide me on what red flags to look for, or some assistance in that manner?
In those situations, I would recommend calling the National Human Trafficking Hotline.
Okay.
You know, they're staffed with individuals who are there who can kind of help in that evaluation.
Okay.
But what I do want to highlight for people is that TAT has an app. You can download that for free. It is available on our website for iPhones, for Androids. And on that app, we have red flags, questions to ask, indicators of labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And then if you turn on kind of location services, it'll let you know what the best number to call based on the location that you're in is. You can also click on the app to make your user experience more tailored to you. So if you are a truck driver, or someone working at a truck stop, or an employee with a public transit agency, or a school bus driver, or an energy field worker, you know, working out in the oil and gas fields, you can select that to then have red flags, things like that, that are a little more specific to your job, be the main things that you're interacting with. But that is one way that people can just have a handy resource that will help be a reminder of things to look for, questions to ask, but also will help in reporting that people can have with them really at any time. But none of those numbers will end up going to us. It all goes to law enforcement or the National Human Trafficking Hotline.
John, any
or
last
one of the
questions?
state human trafficking hotlines. Yeah.
No, I think the one thing that's coming to my mind right now, and you mentioned pornography, but our mainstream media and our entertainment industry, excluding the porn industry, but the regular entertainment, your movies and TVs are not doing, in my opinion, are not doing any favors for the victims of trafficking, because it seems like it's sensationalized, or it's designed to make the viewer desensitized as to what's going on. In other words, we'll use, for example, Pretty Woman. Was she trafficked? I don't know. But all of a sudden, this prostitute becomes, falls in love and has this great life, and it's kind of glorified. And then you have the opposite end of the spectrum where, and forgive me, ladies, y'all may remember the name of it, but there was a recent movie that just came out about trafficking. Child trafficking.
Yes, where they were bringing children from across another country. Yes, and I think, and that, like Annie says, that does happen,
but it's not
the norm, or the what's really happening right before us or under our nose is this,
and that's my point.
This trafficking that we're completely oblivious to, or insensitive to it.
So we're just not, we're getting the wrong message, I think, from the entertainment industry. Mm-hmm. So I really want to commend you for the work that you're doing. I think it's tremendous. It's absolutely wonderful. And I'm excited to see how you're going to grow and how the program is going to develop to help many more victims in the future.
Yes.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Kelly, would you like to share any last words with our viewers about this topic?
I think the biggest thing is, if you see something, say something. Even if you're wrong, get educated. But if you see something, say something. That is the biggest thing. And, if you if it isn't what you think it is, that's okay. That's what law enforcement's there for.
Sure. Well, Kelly, I can't thank you enough for being on our podcast. The courage that you've exhibited today. I know it's not easy to share this part of your life, and thank you for everything you're doing as well, Annie. And so thank both of you ladies for your service to our country, because you are providing a necessary service and educating all of us on this very dangerous problem that's very persistent in our country.
And folks, we will be putting those links and those phone numbers that you heard mentioned on the show today within our show notes. Please make sure that you hit the like button, you subscribe, and you follow. I know we're always saying that every podcast that you look at, they're always telling you that. And there's a reason for that. It's because we're working really hard to bring you very informative content that improves the quality of life, not only here in Kendall County, but the greater Texas Hill Country and the country as a whole. And we need your help to make sure that we're able to get this message or messages like this to as many people as we possibly can. And unfortunately, the only way we can do it is if you're interacting with us and indicating to the platforms that you like this content, you appreciate it, and you want to see more of it. So folks, please look at the show notes. We will have, again, the website and the phone number and anything else that is shared with us, that we will definitely get it put out for you so you can take advantage of trainings and educate yourself and become part of the solution instead of the silent part of the challenge.
Right. And if you want to know more about human trafficking, sex trafficking, or you want to contact Annie or Kelly a little bit more, ask more questions, send us your questions, or we can connect you with these outstanding ladies as well for more information on how to combat human trafficking and how to look for the red flags.
Right.
Again, I'm Robert Sines, my co-host John Tipton. Thank you again for joining us here on the Texas Examiner. It was a great show today. please share it with your friends and family.
Far and wide. Thank you, folks. Have a great afternoon.